Hearing will resume. Mr. Nye, the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Work, I had the pleasure of attending recently a breakfast where you were the guest speaker, and you laid out and described for us the challenges that you're facing right now in terms of Secretary Gates' charge to look carefully at all your spending accounts and find ways to save some money, particularly looking in the overhead arena. And I offered to provide some ideas for ways that I thought we could do that, and that's part of our ongoing communication with you and the Secretary Mabus. But I wanted to note you were describing what Secretary Gates said in May, essentially said military spending on things large and small can and should expect closer, harsher scrutiny. And I think that's a reasonable statement given the fiscal environment that we're in right now. In fact, Secretary Mabus recently said, quoting him, "The expected level of resources over the near to midterm will not sustain every program and every program objective, warranting a willingness to consider trade-offs in even our most deeply held priorities. And there are no sacred cows. Everything is on the table." Do you agree with Secretary Mabus in that assessment?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. What I wanted to ask was, given that constrained environment, and given the new charge that you've been provided by Secretary Gates, even subsequent to the QDR being released, and considering the fact that the proposed redundant nuclear carrier home port in Mayport carries a price tag of approaching $1 billion, estimated, that 4 equivalent facilities exist in the country, including another one on the East Coast, and that theoretically at least those funds could be used for other priorities that are on our list, getting to 313 ships, fixing all of our maintenance backlogs at the facilities and of the ships that we have in the fleet, strike fighter shortfall, all those things that are on that list, including every other priority. What I wanted to ask is, would you agree that those are the kinds of trade-offs that you have to consider?
Yes, sir. In fact, we're in the process of considering them for this budget submission, which I think you know is due up to OSD on the 30th of July. As we looked at Mayport, really it is, we believe the costs are far closer to about $589 million instead of $6 billion. And it is really stretched out over a long period of time. Between FY11 and FY15, it's a grand total of $239 million. So we don't, this is a cost that we believe is very manageable and does not in any way, shape, or form take away from any of the other higher priority goals in the department. We actually think it fits well within the guidance we've been given on the QDR and don't believe it will in any way, shape, or form cause a problem in any of the other things you mentioned.
Well, we can agree or disagree on costs, and oftentimes we do. And this committee has actually asked for, in this year's NDAA, some further studies into what all might be on the table that would lead to a good estimation of what that cost might be at the end of the day. But I think the bottom line and what I'm getting at here is we know there's a cost involved and it's significant. We know that we're in a very tight resource constrained environment and that we've got to make some tough choices and some tough trade-offs. And that's the charge that you're left with. That's the charge that I'm left with in terms of representing a district, but also taxpayer dollars and trying to ensure the folks that fund us that we're using that money as efficiently and appropriately as possible and making some of those tough trade-offs. I just want to note that recently Northrop Grumman announced that it's closing its Avondale shipyard due to excess infrastructure. In fact, they noted that since the Cold War, the size of our fleet has shrunk significantly and they can't afford to keep open an extra facility. I know there are a lot of folks who would like to see that facility remain open. But again, that's a tough choice they had to make about facilities and what we're able to afford going forward. I just say that to highlight the environment that we're in. And I have made no secret of my position on this issue. I strongly believe that whatever the final cost, whether it's $1 billion or something in that time frame, or in that region, over time, we can use that money on things that are more urgent and more pressing for our Navy. So I just want to close by urging you again in the strongest way I can to, as you said, consider those possible trade-offs. Take a look at that project again and going forward, carefully decide whether or not that's really the best possible use of our scarce Navy dollars. But I thank you all for your service. I understand what you've been asked to do is you've been asked to make some very tough, difficult choices. and we want to work with you in that process. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Before I call on Ms. Davis, Mr. Work, recently I asked the proposed price tag on a replacement vessel for the Ohio class submarine. Has the Navy done any studies on whether a replacement such as the Virginia class submarine can perform the same duties with obviously an alteration in the missiles and the ship somewhat?
Yes, sir, we have. Secretary Mabus, when he came aboard last year, and I were first given the briefing on how much this boat could potentially cost, this became one of his focus items from day one. For the last year, the AOA, the Analysis of Alternatives for the Submarines, has occurred. The judgment is that because we have elected to go with the D5 missile, that using the Virginia is not the right way to go, that it is a much better and more efficient thing to exploit our existing infrastructure on a 42 or 43 foot diameter hull. But once that decision was made, Secretary Mabus has asked every single requirement, what is the basis for that requirement, and what is the thing that is driving the cost in the boat? I don't have a final answer for you, Mr. Chairman, but this is at Secretary Mabus's level, and I can assure you that we will have an affordable boat that we can afford in the 20s.
Well, what's interesting, based upon your testimony today, the missile's driving the boat. Have you asked engineers to redesign a missile that might fit on a Virginia-class submarine? This isn't brain surgery. Have you done that?
Sir, I'll have to come back and see if we have done an actual costing, but at the Office of the Secretary of Defense level, it really was, can we afford to design a whole new missile now? And the decision was to stick with the D5 through about 2040. And that will sustain our solid rocket motor base industry. It will take advantage of all of the investments that we've had up to this point. And we believe that is the most inexpensive and the right way to go.
We may be of some help to you on this and help you with a decision, Mr. Work, because it appears the replacement of the Ohio-class submarine is just phenomenal and might well eat into your attempt to reach the 313 ships that we want for the United States Navy. I think you ought to ask the engineers about a missile that might fit in a smaller submarine rather than the multi-billion dollars you might have to sink into a replacement for the Ohio-class submarine. We're talking about efficiencies.
Sir, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for being here and for staying, and a special welcome to Secretary Conaton. Good to have you here. Thank you. I understand that the department and the individual services are looking very, very hard to cut whatever programs are possible, and clearly understood. And I think that we should be doing that. I also understand that we're looking for some efficiencies, and hopefully some of those might even go into quality of life programs for our military personnel and their families. But I am concerned that we may be cutting or even eliminating some programs that are extremely valuable. And I wanted to talk for just a moment about the MyCAA program, the career accounts for our military spouses, career advancement accounts. That program has been wildly popular, as you know. And I wanted to ask, particularly Ms. McGrath, if you could help me understand better the process for weighing programs like that, which when compared to other programs are relatively small dollar amounts, and yet we have many far larger ticket programs out there that gain a lot more attention. But this one in particular, I think, is important to many. So what is it that we are really specifically looking at here? It's been scaled back and may in fact not have nearly the impact that it could have had with a relatively small, larger dollar amount.
Yes, ma'am. We've been talking this morning about obtaining efficiencies across the Department of Defense. We're looking at, and I think it's been mentioned by everybody here, we're looking at everything we do, how we do it, and are we optimizing our performance the way we currently execute today? So major programs, organizational structures, are there better ways to execute? And then when the decisions are made, it is through a very, what I'll call an analytical process where all of the submissions are brought together and every aspect is looked at, both from efficiency, effectiveness, quality of life. Things like wounded warriors certainly would be maintained. We are not looking to degrade, quality of life. But I would say that we're looking at every aspect of what we do when these decisions are made. And so it is not just about, trying to save $1 or move things exactly from, support to infrastructure without the input of quality and quality of life for our service members and their families.
Does the impact and the popularity in many ways of a program, I've had spouses tell me of all the things they have been looking at over the years, all the programs that are offered, this one resonated more than anything else. And I would submit that I think it's worth a second look in that program. And I appreciate your response. We're going to nudge on that one, and because it clearly can make a difference down the line. And I think by so narrowing the program and what's happened in the last directive, we're going to be missing out on a lot of the kinds of opportunities that many of our families might be entering into, which is going to turn around and help the services in the long run. And I don't think this is the time to lose out on those opportunities. I also wanted to just raise one other issue, if I may, within the time that I have. And that's for you, Secretary Work. If you could just speak for a moment, because Admiral Roughead had said that predictable ship procurement allow the industry to stabilize its workforce and retain the critical skills necessary to national security. And Admiral Mullen also has noted earlier. And in light of that, when we look at the MLPs, the mobile landing platforms, being spread out over a period of 5 years versus 3 years, which does not maximize the workforce, how do you look at those programs and try and make those decisions? Because I think we certainly have a strong example or two of where pushing that, the opportunity to move within a 3-year period would make a huge difference in terms of maintaining the kind of people that we need to be involved in those programs.
Yes, ma'am. Secretary Mabus is committed to maintaining 10 ships across the FIDP. 10 ships per year across the FIDP, 50 ships per year. And within the balance of the resources that we can put to the new ship construction. And we have to make these choices every day. More often, sometimes we do have to go to every other year procurement, but in this case, we work directly with NASCO, for example, to work out with them on how they could achieve favorable rates using this existing legislation. And we will continue to work with the industrial base in every case to try to work through in the most efficient and effective way, given the limitation of resources and the priorities that we're trying to balance across the department.
Thank you. I know they're difficult questions and issues, but I think in the long run, the taxpayer will be saving if we can figure out a better way to do that. And I'd like to yield to my colleague, Mr. Nye, for my remaining time.
I want to thank Ms. Davis for her interest in the MyCAA program and just follow up by saying I also think the program has provided some tremendous value to our military spouses. And earlier this year, I was contacted by a number of spouses who complained that the program was changed without a lot of notification to them. And I want to urge you in your review of this program to please do as much outreach with the military spouses as possible to hear their views about it before you make changes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Does any other member wish to ask a question? Mr. Bishop.
Thank you for staying around so long. You timed it very well. Ms. Conaton, I'm extremely happy to see you here again in your current position, and I want to thank you for all the service you gave to us, both when you were in charge of the Minority Council and then the Majority Council. I wish you best in this new endeavor as well. I am also most familiar, I suppose, with the Air Force bases, and I realize that we have a lot of infrastructure needs in all military, but especially the Air Force right now, and especially with the MILCON process that we have. One of the ideas that this committee has long promoted for years is the concept of enhanced use leasing, which tries to leverage private sector dollars along with the military spending to try and utilize or underutilized properties that may belong to the DOD for the benefit of both the private sector as well as for military spending. I know in my area, Falcon Hill project, which is extremely important, we're looking at maybe $500 million worth of money, revenue that can come to the Air Force over 30 years for needed infrastructure development. So I guess a couple of questions on that line. What is the Air Force position going forward about promoting and fostering enhanced use leases as a tool to help bridge the gap between the lack of MILCON resources and the need that is out there?
Thank you, Mr. Bishop, and I appreciate the opportunity to continue what's been a dialogue with you and other members of your delegation on this issue. I think enhanced use leases are a very important tool as we look at how to best invest our MILCON dollars, so I'd agree with the premise of your question.
Does the Air Force have a process or a system in place to help review potential problems with EULs or to recommend to Congress any legislative fixes or authorities that may be needed to promote them?
Sir, I'd like to get back to you, I think, with a more precise answer for the record about any additional needs that we might have there. I guess all I'd say in a general sense is that I think the dialogue between these committees and the services and between individual delegations and the services is critically important on this, and I'll get you a more detailed answer for the record.
That would be fair, and I think also better for me as well as the Department or the Air Force in this case, with a more detailed answer later on to that question. I'm making the assumption that you have not experienced any institutional resistance from the Department of Defense in fostering an EUL.
Sir, not that I'm aware of. As you know, there are a number of enhanced use leases that are very complex and complicated in their specifics, and so the Air Force staff has been working to talk through those issues that might be of concern to OSD, recognizing that some of these instances are more complicated than others.
In every effort where we start something that's a little bit innovative or new or different, there are sometimes institutional concerns or problems that probably can be easily worked out if our mindset is that we want this to be successful from the outset. And I think I appreciate you saying very clearly that this is one of those vehicles that we can use to try and move forward into helping some of the infrastructure needs that we have, and I appreciate your positive answers. I look forward to the more complete answer, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
I do as well, sir. Thank you.
Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. McGrath, what progress has been made in addressing the items on the GAO's latest high-risk list for the Department of Defense?
So as I mentioned in my opening statement, we address the high-risk areas not as sort of an additional thought, but as our everyday thought. They're included in our strategic planning document for the business base, which is the strategic management plan. They are all aligned within those 4 goals, so we take proactive measures to address them each day. Each one of the high-risk areas has a plan identified. It has appropriate governance in place. We utilize the Defense Business Systems Management Committee to review each one of the high-risk areas. We meet with the Government Accountability Office frequently on each of the areas, in addition to the Office of Management and Budget, to ensure that we are keeping our eye on the ball. We also have identified milestones and measures for each one of them, and we track performance quarterly through the DBSMC. So I would say, I mentioned some specifics on the personnel clearance reform. We have made certainly a lot of progress there. The management attention, the plan, the proactive measures, all our tools we need to actually make progress on each one of those, and I believe that we are making progress in each one, and I'm happy to talk about any of them in specific detail, or just talk in sort of general terms about where we are with each one, but I'm comfortable and I can clearly state that we are making progress.
To each of the undersecretaries, let me ask this. Each of you have adopted, it appears, different management structures for business transformation. For instance, I note that Lieutenant General Durbin's here, and why are your approaches and staffing levels for this endeavor so very, very different? Mr. Westphal?
Mr. Chairman, you're right. Every service has different processes, although some of our processes are, of course, the same. In the case of the Army, there were, prior to the Secretary McHugh and I coming on board, the Army had instituted under the previous administration an enterprise task force, an enterprise approach to management. We examined that closely, and with the mandate from Congress to establish an Office of Business Transformation, we made the decision to incorporate that management enterprise approach within the context of business transformation and apply it holistically across the Army. Now, that enterprise approach had a staff that had been created to help manage the process under the then Deputy Undersecretary of the Army. I took some of that staff and brought it into to create and establish the Office of Business Transformation, because they had already been engaged in business transformation activities. That helped me immensely to be able to then immediately take hold of the planning, programming, budget execution piece, which we were came in the middle of, and really manage the POM process, the planning process, and establish what I call the Army Management Enterprise, which is basically the Secretariat in lead with the Army staff in support to put forth what we call the Army Campaign Plan, which is essentially the direction that we at headquarters give to the Army holistically across the board. So it allows me to integrate planning, business transformation, the resourcing decisions, to bring it to a level of integrated discussion among and across all sectors of the Army, led by the Assistant Secretaries, with me and through to the Secretary of the Army, to get decisions done. And then in addition to that, we established something called the Army Enterprise Board, which is a four-star board led by me, but an advisory board to the Secretary of the Army of all the 4 stars, that is Secretariat and uniform, to basically become a forum for discussion of major issues that need to be resolved across the Army.
Thank you, Mr. Work.
Well, sir, the way I would answer this is I think there's great strength in the way the department is handling this now. Each of the unders come with a little bit of different background. Secretary Conaton comes from Congress. Secretary Westphal has been in the building before. And Ms. McGrath, the way it works now, sir, is that we establish common goals across the Department of Defense and the departments. We each have to come up with our business transformation plan and our business enterprise architecture. But each of us come at it a different way, and I would argue it's a strength. We have meetings at the DBSMC, the Defense Business Systems Management Council, chaired by Secretary Lynn, in which we come in and say how we would approach a problem. And we have discussions on what are the best practices. Ms. McGrath meets with the unders quite often, and then the unders meet themselves along with our financial management and comptrollers. And by setting it up the way we do, where we all have common goals and common plans, but we can approach the problem differently, we actually, I think, are better for it. And it makes for a very innovative approach to this, where we all have a common goal, and that is to prepare the best and most efficient business operations for the department.
Mr. Conaton.
I certainly agree with everything that Secretary Work just said. Just for a brief moment, talk about the Air Force structure. Obviously, like my colleagues, serving as the Chief Management Officer, I have a very able Deputy Chief Management Officer, Mr. Tillotson, who also is dual-hatted as our Director of the Office of Business Transformation. The choice in the Air Force was to relatively leanly staff that office and rather to make use of expertise that exists throughout the functional secretariat and air staff, recognizing that transformation's got to occur in the actual activities of those parts of the department rather than mandated from the outside. We also have representation, folks in different parts of the country at our major commands who have expertise in Lean Six Sigma approaches and have gone through the effort that the Air Force has, Air Force Smart Operations for the 21st Century, what we call AFSO 21, which is our continuous process improvement, which will help drive transformation outside of the headquarters level as well as in the headquarters itself. But I guess I come back to things that we've talked about, which is that leadership really matters in driving transformation, and so the fact that these issues are brought to the Air Force Council, which is our governance process, has helped us keep a continuous leadership eye on where we need to go with mission and transformation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Bishop has an additional question.
Thank you. I thought that was an important question. I appreciate your answers. Could we have, though, if for the record, if necessary, the staffing levels, the number that we have in from each of you in those particular areas? And if you'd like to do that for the record, so you can get the exact number correct, that would be okay.
Along with that, could you give a summary of the duties about the leaders? You don't have to go all the way down to the bottom, but at least give a summary of the top few, please. The gentlelady, Ms. Carol J. Go ahead. J. Porter.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I wanted to pursue the supplemental and the impact that you believe that it would have. I know that we've seen a lot of votes for and against, both Republicans and Democrats voting for it and against it over a period of time. Has that caused any problems so far? And with the size of the budget, where exactly would you cut? I know that you had talked about pay, but what other options would there be if you didn't receive the supplemental?
I'm not sure exactly. Well, first of all, it would come mostly from our O&M accounts. So depending upon if the supplemental is not passed before the recess, we would then have to go into those accounts and look at what we can do. We have tried to anticipate the possibility that the supplemental wouldn't be passed, and we have submitted or have ready to submit, I can't tell you which one of those two it is, some reprogramming to avert any major issues during August. But sometime in August, we would be having to weigh in how we address a lack of funds in some of those accounts.
Okay, any idea about what you'd be looking at?
We'd be looking at the possibility of some furloughs in some of those O&M areas in the Army, and that would be across various departments and various agencies of the Army.
Okay, has there been any problem to date with the fact that there have been, inability to bring this all the way through? Have you experienced trouble?
No, I mean, we watch carefully, and we monitor, and we certainly have a lot of conversations with staff and members about, about the progress made, and we try to anticipate. And so we've been in an anticipatory move, at least in the Army, and I think all my colleagues would say the same thing in their service. But it's a very unpredictable process, and at the end of the day, we have to just wait until you make those decisions and accept whatever the consequences of those are. So we're reasonably hopeful that you will have a supplemental approved before you leave for recess. We hope that's the case, and that we then will proceed to make sure that we account for those resources the way you want us to.
Okay, anybody else want to answer that?
Well, as you know, ma'am, Secretary Gates sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi as well as all of the chairmen, and basically said this is kind of an unprecedented situation. We haven't been forced we know that if the supplemental is not passed, that some of our base budget operating accounts would begin to deplete in August. And although we would keep exempt civilians on duty, as everyone has said, other civilians might have to be furloughed without pay. And of course, we'd keep our men and women on active duty, but at some point in the third or in the latter part of September, we would run out of money to pay for those. So this is quite an extraordinary circumstance. I can speak for the Department of the Navy for certain. This is not a circumstance that we would like to be faced with.
Right. Would you have to look at some of the contracts, or is that separate? I mean, would you reevaluate some of the contractor deals that we've made?
I think it would depend on what the contract is. To the extent that contracts are issued for work that comes out of the operations and maintenance accounts, I think it would be affected by the drawdown of those accounts in the middle part of August. And the only other thing I'd add to what my colleagues have said on a more general level is the Secretary of Defense has told the services, and I think told other parts of the department really clearly, that we should minimize the disruption to the programs and to our deployed men and women. And we are relying upon Congress, this institution, to provide that supplemental, and that we're going to keep moving on that path. Obviously, we'll plan as we need to for a worst-case scenario, but I think the direction he's given to the services is to trust that the Congress will provide. Thank you.
I just wanted to make sure that the plan would be to protect the men and women who were in uniform. Either way, that's the mission that we all share, and you have reassured me that that will be the top priority. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. If there are no further questions, we thank our panelists for your testimony, for being with us, for your expertise, and especially for your leadership. Thank you again.